Welcome to this very special episode of the BM podcast. My guest today is a very special Jurgen De Wispelaere, with a really, really interesting background, I have to say. When you Google his name, you'll find some things like the basic income globetrotter and other things like that. But I want to give him an opportunity to introduce himself.
Good, great. Well, thanks, Ahmed, for having me. I promise I won't be moving during this podcast. I'll stay in the same place.
That's great. So tell us a little bit about your story, Jürgen, like about where you began or like where you are now.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So I'll give you the very, very short version because we're supposed to have this done in 1 hour, right? So so I'm originally from Belgium, same country as Philippe van Parijs and Yannick van der Burgt. So, I have no pressure on basic income pedigree there. So I live in Chile actually at the moment. So I kind of have lived pretty much around the world. I moved around a lot in the past couple of decades, but at the moment, I'm sort of for the past couple of years, I've been living in Chile, in the south, in Patagonia, so not Santiago, like really, really south. But at the moment, I also work in Germany. So, so it's a bit of a commute. So that means I spend part of my year in Chile and then I come to Germany where I do some teaching and research. So I'm associated with the Götz Werner chair as a visiting professor and of course with Freiburg, which many people know, which is the Freiburg Basic Income Studies, Freiburg Institute for Basic Income Studies. There you go. So I've been doing basic income for quite a long time. I was actually thinking about this, and my first Bien Congress was 1998 in Amsterdam. So that's a long time ago. So it's the same Congress. I was on a panel with Carl Weiderquist. So Carl and I started the same Congress the first time, and we were on a panel together, et cetera, et cetera. So, and I've kind of been, I tried to escape from basic income a few times, but it's a little bit of a trap. Once you get in there, you can't get away anymore. So there you are. So many years down the road. I'm still doing basic income. And I recently joined Bien Executive Committee as the research coordinator. So, I'm trying to do a bit of work in terms of linking Bien a bit more in terms of a lot of growing research activity around the world, really, right? So, as you know, basic income in the last 10 years has really, really evolved massively. So we see a lot happening on the policy side. We see a lot happening on the advocacy side, but we also see a lot happening on the research side. So Bien is also trying to catch up with that part. And that's partly my job. And maybe one more thing. So I guess in terms of research, because that's kind of, I always do the advocacy research side, but primarily I am really involved on the research side. So I started off as a philosopher and then at some point really got interested in politics and political economy and policy. So a lot of my work is really on that side. So the thing that I'm really, really fascinated by is the whole politics around basic income, basically. So I think that's it, really.
So would you define yourself as a scientist or a philosopher or as an advocate?
Sorry, what? Who do I describe myself?
Yeah, like how would you define yourself?
I stopped calling myself a philosopher because I still hang out with the philosophers. Some of my best friends are philosophers. I don't mind them, but I moved over to the dark side of politics these days. So more political science than philosophy. So, and as for advocacy, so here's the funny thing. If I have to present my work into a room of basic income skeptics, I become very much an advocate. And if I present my work in a room of basic income advocates, I become the guy who says, hold on, guys, don't go too fast. We need to think about this. We need to worry about that. So I'm very adaptable. I'm a contrarian. I always do the opposite, what's in the room, something like that.
Keeping the balance.
Something like that. Yeah, exactly.
So, what got you interested into basic income, if I can ask?
Actually, Philippe van Parijs's book got me interested. So long time ago, I did my master's dissertation in philosophy on the concept of work. So it was a lot of sort of, historical analysis and looking at the big thinkers, work in Marx and in Adam Smith and different sort of movements. And at the very end, this was when Philippe had just published Real Freedom for All. So I read that book and I was really fascinated by it. So that was the first moment I sort of got in touch with him. And then I went to a lecture series by Walter van Trier, who you probably don't know, but who back in the days, this is ancient history, right? So I'm an old guy, so back in the days, the good old days. Walter van Trier was a sort of an economic historian in Belgium who wrote a huge dissertation on the concept of basic income especially in the UK. But so he actually gave a series of lectures at the same time, public lectures actually. So not academic lectures, but as part of one of these, Belgian societies that does lectures for the general public. And he did a whole series on basic income. And I went to that and I was really fascinated by that. So two Belgians basically were responsible for bringing me into it. And it kind of started from there. I got intrigued by it, started talking to a few more people. And, as I said, once you get lured into it, you can't get out, right? It's this is it. So.
Why did you try to get out?
Oh, I tried to get out several times. Never worked.
So are you now becoming like, you've seen progress over years? You've been like for over 20 years now. Are you more optimistic or less optimistic than when you started?
About Bien or about basic income? Two very different things. I'm very optimistic about Bien. So I used to be on the executive committee like a long time ago, sort of I think it was 2002 to 2004. So 20 years ago, I was already on the executive committee. And at that time I left because at that time Bien really wasn't doing anything. I mean, we were all volunteers. There wasn't much backup. There wasn't not much happening. So it was all very, I don't know, like
the chat club.
Not much movement. I mean, people were not a lot of ideas, no way to immediately see how it was moving forward. So I became very skeptical about Bien for a long time. But then I have to say, when Sarat got elected as the chair, I saw a lot of things changing, and I ended up getting in touch with several people, did a lot of work with Neil Howard recently, the last couple of years, and various other people, had conversations with Toru Yamamori, who was my predecessor as a research coordinator. And they all convinced me that things were really moving. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm joining Bien now, because in a sense, Bien is really becoming a much more professional organization, which of course is very important in the current climate, right? The current policy climate. I mean, as for Bien, as for basic income, that's a tricky one, right? So with my political science hat on, I'm always thinking, well, we need more research, we need more evidence. I'm not sure. It's very obvious that things have changed a lot, right? I mean, 10 years ago, of course, we were talking about basic income, but if you were going to a Bien Congress, for example, it was a great conference and we were all, having a good time and we were all very optimistic, but we were basically dreamers in many ways, right? So as soon as we leave the Congress, reality was kind of kicking us in the face quite hard. And loads of people outside the basic income movement were extremely skeptical. Researchers, policymakers didn't want to hear about it. A lot of activists. I mean, for example, it was hard sometimes to link with activists from other types of areas. So, for example, I don't know, people who are advocating for disability rights were skeptical about basic income, for example. So there wasn't that easy to link, right? And in the last 10 years, or maybe a couple more, whatever, 12, 13 years, things really, really changed, right? So at the moment, when you talk basic income, no one thinks you're crazy. There's still a lot of people skeptical, but they're skeptical, they have to take it seriously. You can't just sort of pretend that basic income is this really silly idea. That time has passed. Now, pretty much in every government around the world, there's at least some people who've heard of basic income, possibly even might be really, really interested in it, etc., etc. So it looks like basic income is not going away. At the same time, it's not yet been implemented in a full form anywhere, right? So we have this very interesting kind of dynamic. This is what I'm telling my students here. I said, we have to answer two questions. Why don't we have basic income, and why is it not going away? So this is the really, really interesting time that we live in at the moment, right?
And what's your answer?
I don't have a clear answer. We need more research for that one. So give us more money so we can do more research. Yeah. No, I think a key important explanation for why it's not going away is all these experiments and the trials. Because, 10, 12 years ago, we were just talking. There wasn't that much we could concretely point to. Now you have all these experiments happening, but even before that, for example, you had the Swiss referendum, right, which had a major campaign. Of course, we now had several presidential candidates, Andrew Yang in the US, we had Korean presidential candidate as well. So we now live in a time where if you talk about basic income, it's not just an idea anymore. People start getting a much more clear sense of something like an actual policy proposal, right? So when basic income advocates, a lot of them are getting a bit impatient with the experiments. They think that, how much more evidence do we need? We already know basic income works. Why don't we just implement it?
Yeah, don't we have like a ton of evidence? Like,
sorry?
there are books full of evidence, right?
So
if I'm not wrong, you've written a book about evidence, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I think people forget that basic income experiments are really part of this whole process. Without them, I don't think we would be where we are at the moment. So for me, we can be very critical about each of these experiments in all sorts of ways, but I think altogether they play a big role in explaining why basic income debate is where it is at the moment. How come so many people know about it? How come decision makers know about it? People are interested in it. Media keeps talking about it, etc., etc. Right?
So, and for the second question, why didn't it happen yet?
Why didn't it happen? Well, that's where politics really does come in, right? So there's so many slightly complicated reasons why that step from doing an experiment to actually then having impact is really, really very difficult. But to be honest, we're only at the very start of trying to understand this, right? You have to keep in mind that a lot of these experiments are very, very recent, right? So the Finnish experiment, for example, is only a couple of years old, right? So you need a bit of time for something like that to filter into the political process, etc., etc. So we're now in the process of various people around the world are starting to look at this topic. But it's very much a start of a research agenda trying to understand this. But it's very obvious, look, basic income, it's a really, really, really interesting idea, but it remains a controversial idea. For us within Bien, so to speak, we think this is a no-brainer, like we should do basic income. It has all the advantages, etc., etc. But for many, many people outside, it remains a very controversial topic, right? So in a sense, understanding the politics of it and understanding how to move from the sort of the politics of experiments to the politics of actual policy. This is really one of the interesting agendas, but it's a very, very new, recent agenda as far as I'm concerned, right?
So we need more research because there are like more points we need to identify, or we need more research to be able to convince the people, or both?
Well, I mean, you need more research to understand the processes that are happening in actual cases. So, for example, I mean, we often talk about basic income and about experiments as if they're the same thing no matter where they happen. But the basic income debate in Finland is not the same one as Germany, it's not the same one as Egypt, it's not the same one as Chile, etc., right? So there's a lot of differences that we need to understand in each of these countries, okay? So that's one of the reasons why a lot of people now are looking much, much more specifically at specific country cases, but also comparing countries, because that's where we get a lot of the insights, right? And again, this is new research. So yes, there's a lot that we need to understand.
So like, let's look for a comparison. You're really involved in the Finnish program, right?
I mean, I was involved in the year before the experiment itself happened. So there was a year where a number of researchers and different organizations were sort of studying it and coming up with the design. And I was a consultant as part of that, yes.
So how would you compare, like, for example, the basic income debate in Finland or in Belgium with Chile? I imagine those are really different countries.
I mean, they are very, very different countries. So Finland, I mean, what's really, really interesting in Finland is, they became very, very famous for doing the basic income experiment. They're now also slightly famous or infamous for basically ignoring anything to do with basic income, right? I mean, like at the moment, it looks like basic income is really not, it's not just that it's not happening in Finland, it's not even being discussed, etc., right? And one of the problems, I think, is that when they did the experiment, they were really focusing a lot on the science aspect of it. So the idea was, we were going to do this experiment, we're going to do the science. Basically, we're going to stop the debate for 2 years, we'll let the experiment, and then we pick up the debate again. But politics doesn't work like that. I mean, 2 years in politics is a long, long time. So by the time the experiment was finished and evaluated, the Finnish government had already moved on to a very different area, right? So there's an important lesson there. The important lesson is that when we're doing basic income experiments, we have to think that these are policy experiments. There's a science side, there's a politics side, right? Both are important. And both need to be somehow featured in this whole process, right? So if you compare that, for example, with Ontario, Ontario is very famous for the fact that the experiment got cancelled, and that's really, really unfortunate, right? And actually, it's not just unfortunate, it's a disgrace what the government did at the time. But one of the really interesting things about Ontario is that somehow they really managed to use the experiment, however little of it that actually happened. They really managed to link that into the sort of the activist community, the advocacy community. So there was a lot more public engagement, there's a lot more talk. And in a sense, the experiment there really helped boosting the actual debate around basic income, right? So there's a really paradoxical situation. Finland, on the one hand, experiment, fully completed, evaluated report, and the debate goes down. Ontario starts, get cancelled, lots of problems, but meanwhile, in some sense, the debate really became a big thing there, right? So it's really interesting to compare both situations and say, okay, what are the lessons that we can learn here, right? And how can we apply this to other cases?
So what is the reason, like, why did it catalyze the debate in Canada, and why does it like kill the debate in Finland?
Yeah, I mean, there's, as you can imagine, a political scientist would say there's no one single reason, right? So I'm going to say this as well. There's no one single reason. We have to stop looking for very simple explanations, but I'll tell you one big reason, and that has an important lesson. One of the problems in the Canadian case was that they started an experiment which they knew was going to run across an election. This is a dangerous thing, right? So you start with a government that's committed to an experiment, but then there's an election. There's a big chance another party, another coalition will come in, and they will have different priorities. They will have different views. This is exactly what happened in Ontario, right? New government, and within weeks, they canceled the basic income experiment. They had no interest whatsoever. So what's the lesson here? And by contrast, in Finland, it was very clear they wanted to have it all done within one election cycle, right? So there's a big lesson here. The big lesson is that probably we need these basic income experiments to be quite short. Why? Because if we make them long, as many advocates argue saying we should have longer basic income experiments. It's going to show us much more what people want. The problem with those is you run into these political troubles, right? If you have a long experiment, chances that politics is going to intervene and somehow, break it up are going to be quite high. If you have a short experiment, within the government election cycle, they're going to be committed to it. It's at least, chances are higher that they're going to keep going, that at least it will be finished as planned, there will be an evaluation, etc. Okay, so there are some interesting lessons from comparing what's going on in different parts of the world, right?
Do you know what's the impact of the Finnish project, positive, negative? Do you know what was the impact or the results of that Finnish project?
So the impact, in short, seems to be at the moment zero. So, as in the policy impact, right? So it's one thing to talk about the scientific results.
Yeah, also the scientific results.
Right, okay. So the scientific results, it depends what you look at, okay? So, for example, some effects on employment, but very, very minimal. Much, much more effects, for example, on things like government trust, right? So one of the interesting features, and this is kind of well known, right? Everyone more or less shares this view. We all know that basic income experiments are not really capable to tell us a lot about, say, for example, employment effects, right? Why? Because they don't last a long time, because the way they're designed, there's a lot of things you can't capture through them, right? People are not going to necessarily make sort of big decisions around labor market features when they only get 2 years and the level of basic income may not be enough. And then it also gets linked into, for example, it's very hard to link the taxes into an experiment like that. It's very hard to figure out how it links into other types of programs that some of these people are still entitled to, etc. It gets really, really complicated fast. It's very tricky to get an experiment going that tells us a lot about, say, things like labor market. But that is what politicians always want to know, is the one thing that they're all interested in, right? They want to know whether a basic income is going to create more incentives for employment or, working more hours, etc. Or by contrast, whether it's going to, cause people to drop out. And, kind of what we're seeing is, a bit of this and a bit of that. But not really amazing results either way. So, but then the experiments tend to tell us a lot more about things like well-being and trust and potential reasons for thinking that maybe it has a positive health effect, right? I mean, one of the really fascinating results, what you're getting, is that something like a basic income seems to increase people's sort of trust trust in the welfare state, trust in government, trust in society, general trust, trust in other people, etc. I mean, to me, this is really, really important because, as we know at the moment, we live in very polarized societies. Everyone is very divided. People don't trust each other. They don't trust politics. They don't trust the state. They don't trust this. They don't trust that. And, one of the implications is, whatever, Trump and you name it, right? All that sort of stuff. So, so it is interesting to see that basic income has broader effects that are really, really interesting, right? So, and of course, at the individual level, I mean, there's a lot of individual recipients who find personally that they had a major impact, even in short experiments like something like 2 years, right? Yeah.
So, like, what's the reason that politicians, like, you're a scientist and a political man and a philosopher, so you understand politicians, I guess. So what's the reason that politicians only care about, like, GDP numbers, employment numbers? Why don't they care about trust numbers, happiness, and care only about, like, those hard figures?
Sure. I mean, the thing with politicians, if you like, is if we want to convince politicians that they should adopt the basic income, and one of the things we need to do is we need to work on their political incentives, right? So effectively, politicians respond to pressure. So we need to be able to somehow pressure them in a way that basically says, look, there's going to be whatever, some electoral consequences, etc., etc. So, I mean, politicians tend to be, fairly risk averse and, kind of, they're not necessarily into, thinking outside of the box very much, right? So keep in mind that usually this is not just politicians. This is a politician with a whole entourage of people, with a political party, etc. They're all being tied in with polls, etc. They poll people all the time about, what do we think about this? What do we think about that? So basic income is a risky proposition, if you like, right? So it's a risky proposition to be attached to. So they all go a bit like, well, let's see what happens. Let's stay with the things that we're familiar with, right? So,
but we don't need a dictator to implement it, right?
Well, no, ideally not. That would be slightly problematic in various other ways. I mean, let's put it this way. Do I think that a dictatorship might be able to implement the basic income? Possibly, because they can implement a lot of things better. But is that worth it? That's a very separate question, right? So, okay, so two very different things. No, so, I mean, no, I mean the thing we need to figure out, and in a way we're doing this, right? We're building up a lot of pressure time by time with a lot of these experiments, with a lot of debates, with convincing different people time and time, not just the ministers, for example. We're convincing a lot of people who work, say, for example, in departments as civil servants, or, the people who do the actual policy ideas and the implementation, etc. So that, that can take a bit of time, but time and time again, I think, in a way, we sort of just bit by bit have to push for it. And then hoping that at some point there's an opportunity, a window of opportunity, and we can come in there, right? So we have to see.
What I find really interesting, because you could say, like, that basic income is a rather, like, populist policy, like it should get like support from the people. But at the same time, when you look at, like, for example, at the German media, you find that some of the biggest opponents to basic income are actually, like, the Sunday press and the people who, like, normally target that populism. So how would you explain that?
I mean, I think it's wrong to think that basic income is a populist idea, right? I mean, for various reasons. I mean, if you think about a basic income, right? I mean, it very much depends on the detail of the design, how many people are actually going to benefit from this, right? I mean, yes, a basic income, if it's universal, effectively gives everyone a basic income. But that doesn't mean that everyone is a net beneficiary, right? I mean, some people are going to have to pay for it, no matter how, you can have a lot of different ways of thinking about how to finance a basic income, but someone's going to have to pay for it, right? So
Yeah.
so it's not populist in the sense that this is going to create an obvious major crowd of people who suddenly realize, oh wow, I'm going to get this basic income and it's going to make my life much better, right? People really, really worry about this. It's also not helped by the fact that we do have a lot of factions going on in basic income, right? So for example, I mean, at the moment, we have, say, tech entrepreneurs, tech billionaires supporting basic income, whatever. You got Elon Musk at some point coming on what used to be Twitter, saying that he likes basic income, or Zuckerberg, or Bezos, and so on. And at the same time, the more that happens, the more skeptical the trade unions get, right? So they think, hold on, if the rich people are in favor, clearly something is up here, right? So, I mean, and I have to say, within the basic income movement, we haven't been great at engaging with the labor movement, right? I mean, there's exceptions, of course, but by and large, we tend to think of trade unions as the skeptical people who don't understand basic income, and they're kind of a little bit like the enemy. And it's like, I don't buy that, right? I think we should really take these people much, much more seriously, and we need to put in a lot of work convincing them that what we are offering is not the famous Trojan horse, and it's going to ruin the trade union movement and the workers, etc. Right? So, I mean, so the moment you talk about basic income, the tricky thing is that you have different factions sort of agreeing with parts of it, but these factions don't necessarily like each other, right? Right. So
who is the enemy? Or is
sorry?
there an enemy? Is there an enemy? And if yes, who is the enemy?
Who's the enemy? I'm not sure who the enemy is. I think we can each find one if we really want one. But it's not so much about the enemy, right? It's about building the friends. Okay. So this is the key feature. I mean, when you're talking basic income, when you're talking any policy making, right? Any major reform that you want to put in society, it's all about building coalitions and building constituencies. So this is the thing where we need to work and where we need to think very carefully. But for example, having more engagement with trade unions, I think would be really, really important, right? It's something that I think is worth doing. I'm at the moment talking to some people, have some conversations that I started a few years ago with some people in ILO, where the ILO on the one hand is very sympathetic to something like basic income, but at the other hand, they're very keen on maintaining social insurance and building up social protection through social insurance. So whenever we have these conversations, they want to know, how do these two things fit together? So we need to have these conversations with them and say, okay, let's figure it out together, right? Let's figure out the way these two things can fit together. But in a sense, where, I mean, we with basic income, we had to fight so many years to basically for people just to take the idea seriously. But now we have to shift to a different stage, which is people are taking the idea seriously. Now let's figure out how it works in practice with the complicated systems that we have in place, and how is it that basic income going to fit in there, right? Without creating any sort of strange bad results, without being a Trojan horse, without doing any of these sort of things, right? So, but that's a lot of work, right? That's a lot of work that needs to happen, and a lot of people doing the work, I have to say. Like there's a lot of people doing the work, but we're still in the process of all putting it together, and so.
Can I ask you, like, what are the research you're actually like right now focusing on?
Myself.
Yeah.
So I got a couple projects. So one of the projects that I sort of started last year that I'm really interested in is I'm actually intrigued in the sort of the fancy title is the political commitment of basic income experiments. So the short story is the following. If you look at a lot of these experiments, they all start off with political parties being committed. But then as the experiment begins, there's always problems with this commitment. So Ontario, I already mentioned, is the crazy case where in the middle of an election and it just got cancelled, right? Okay. But for example, as you probably know, the Catalan pilot not last year, a few months ago, basically, in the Catalan parliament, it actually got defunded. So while the office that's organizing the pilot is still in place and they're still doing a lot of work, at the moment, the budget for actually running the pilot is gone, right? So this again is an example of, like people are doing the work, setting this up, and then politics intervenes, right? So, I mean, even in the Finnish case, for example, the Finnish case is a very positive one in the sense that, it was planned for 2 years, it ran for 2 years, etc. But at some point, people were trying to argue to expand it and to extend it over time. And their politicians as well said, no, we're not having this. So in a sense, underlying all these different cases is sort of an account of how can we protect basic income experiments from politics. And it's really interesting because first you need politics to get it started, and then you need politics to go away. So this is, it's a bit like it's the teenager, right? The teenager, when you're like 12, 13, you want your parents because they have money and you want to go shopping with your mom because she has the money. But then as soon as you have all the goods, you want the parents to go away so you can hang out with your friends who are much cooler, right? So it's a bit like that.
They're not cool politicians who want to...
No, politicians are not cool. So we need politicians for starting these basic income experiments, and then we need them to get out of the way and stay out of the way, right? It's really fascinating. How do we do these two things at the same time, right?
So do you think that the basic income should be actually financed by the government? Because there were like people, I think it was Varoufakis, who were like having that idea of a basic income like a citizen's dividend, like that you have like kind of a fund, I guess, and that the returns finance the basic income. How do you think it should be financed?
Sure.
Yeah, exactly, something more of like that.
Sure. I mean, it's one way, right? So the Marika project, for example, the solidarity economy and the basic income, the quasi basic income that they have in Marika in Brazil, that's effectively funded that way, more or less, right? Or at least it's funded through oil licenses, and they're in the process of setting it up as a sovereign wealth fund. Alaska famously, of course, is the same. So it's great. So if you have a resource, you can turn it into a sovereign wealth fund. I mean, of course, that's fine. But that is in a way still a government decision, right? I mean, so the idea that somehow is not government, as actually many people in Alaska think, to me is a bit strange, because at some point government has decided to set this up and to do this, right? And in other places, government decides to do different things, so it's still part of policy. Look, for me personally, I always felt it slightly strange, but that's a personal view, right? People have different views on this. I always felt it slightly strange to think of basic income as an alternative to the welfare state. I think the welfare state is really a major achievement after the Second World War. And I think basic income is sort of the next stage of the welfare state, if you like, right? It's not just basic income, it's basic income integrated in a whole set of, in a whole institution with a lot of other programs it interacts with. But basic income is a big part of that. To me, that's not opposed to the welfare state. To me, that's part of the welfare state. But that also means it is really about policy, right? It is the thing that a state does for its residents, the members of the polity, right? Okay, so I don't see how you can get away from that per se.
And like, so let's assume you're now like a politician, let's say in Belgium or in Chile, you choose, and you're part of a party, you decide which party, and you want to promote a basic income, or you want to convince the politicians for a basic income. Which steps would you take?
Yeah. So there's a reason I'm a political scientist and not an actual politician, right? I'm very happy to study this stuff. There's no way I actually want to be involved in it. Like, I'm not good at it. So I don't know the internal strategy stuff. So I mean, it's a very good question, right? So I mean, I sort of don't have a direct answer for you, but I'll tell you one thing. There's sort of, there's two cases that I'm fascinated by at the moment: Finland and Ireland. Why Finland and Ireland? Because both of these are coalition governments, or were at the time coalition governments, that at some point decided to have a basic income as part of their coalition agreement. So you have different parties in one coalition, and somehow a basic income experiment comes out of that. But in the Finnish case, for example, there were very obvious parties in that coalition that were pretty much against basic income, not interested in basic income. The same to some extent in Ireland, different configuration, right? I would have loved to be a fly on the negotiation table to listen to what is it that actually brought that result, right? What is it that the advocates of basic income had to promise or to compromise in order for something like a basic income experiment to come out of it? And then I'd be really, really interesting to see what is the sort of negotiation, the sort of compromises we have to do in order to get an actual basic income policy out of this, right? I mean, I have no clear idea, right? I'm not sure what it is that a politician can do or promise. I don't think it's about convincing colleagues, maybe a little bit, right? Because some people still have very strange ideas, especially in politics. People still have strange ideas about basic income. So it can't hurt that we inform them better. It can't hurt that we bring them into our discussions and we can show them that, no, we're not crazy people. We have really good ideas here. We thought it out very carefully, etc., etc. I think that helps. But I think ultimately, it kind of is about, political pressures and political compromises, right? So I'm not sure what is the one thing as a politician I would be able to do, so to speak, to really bring that over the hurdle, right?
So let's go back to science if you don't like the politics.
Sure.
Scientists like questions. Which questions
Depends
do
on
you
the
want to
question. Which question that I would like to ask?
No, which question would you like to answer? Like, are you trying to answer? What are the questions that keep you up at night?
There's too many of those.
Sometimes.
Yeah, but most things that keep me up at night is trying to worry about how many meetings did I miss yesterday, and so there's a lot of things like that, very practical things. But yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, like in a sense, if you think about, I find basic income research a genuinely fascinating field, like as in a weird sort of way. We've been doing this for a long time, but I think it gets more fascinating and more interesting every year, right? And for several reasons. One, because we just have many more cases at the moment, right? We have more countries involved in this. We have more debates. For example, we get more survey evidence, we get more micro simulations, we get more experiments. I mean, all of that is just, each of these things is just data and cases that we can start analyzing, right? But what's really interesting, we now getting into a stage where a lot of people who don't consider themselves basic income people are looking at this properly, right? So within the Bien movement, of course, it's always, I mean, some of us, like myself, we've been around for a couple of decades, and then there's a lot of new people come in as part of the basic income movement, which is great. It's growing, right? But it's really interesting to notice that on the outside, this is growing as well. So a lot of the really good research isn't done by people who are basic income people. This is done by political scientists or sociologists or economists or policy specialists who just look at basic income. They look at any other policy, They analyze basic income the same way they analyze healthcare or transport or climate change or whatever. And this is really, for me, this is really fascinating because it means we're really building up a vast network now of researchers. And one of the things, kind of coming back to my role in Bien, one of the things that I would like to do within this and the next year is linking Bien and the basic income researchers, people who consider themselves basic income researchers, much more to these sort of outsiders, if you like, right? I think there's a bit of separation between what these people on the outside are doing and what we're doing on the inside. And I think we need to talk. We need to talk, we need to compare, we need to exchange, we need to do all these sort of things. They need to come to our conferences, we need to go to their conferences, if that makes any sense, right? So, and I think in a way, the moment we start doing this, it's going to get even more fascinating, right? So, and so many questions are coming up in every dimension you can imagine, every issue around basic income. It links in so many different ways with so many different ideas. So, there's just no end to the questions, if you like, right?
So you gave us a great response about why there are a lot of questions, but you didn't give us a question.
I don't like to think of one question. So here's the thing. I have the attention span of a goldfish. If I focus on one thing for more than 5 minutes, I get bored and I want to do something else. So it's good to have multiple questions.
One or two questions, like things that you were trying to answer.
Okay, well, the one I already told you, right? The one I told you, which is the whole political economy commitment. Exactly. How can we get politicians to support experiments and then get away, right? Yes, that's a very interesting scientific question and a practical question, right? Because how do we design experiments that keep the politicians away, right? So a very different question. Actually, I'll tell you, this is another project that we're now working on with a number of people. I already told you about Maricá, the municipality in Brazil. So one of the things we now see is that there's a lot of other places in Brazil, both in Rio de Janeiro, the state, but also outside. A lot of municipalities are starting to pick up this idea. So what explains that? Like, why is it that municipalities that are actually quite different from each other, some of them are poor, some of them are rich, some of them have a left-wing government or a right-wing government, some have access to oil, some not, right? How is it that they all start using this same idea? And second related question, as they start in using this idea, they all transform it in their own little way. So, why is it that the idea of basic income from Maricá has gone viral, and why has it mutated into slightly different variants? That for me is a really fascinating. I think that part of the world at the moment is one of the most interesting things to look at.
As you mentioned Brazil, because as you mentioned, you live a lot in Chile. We didn't talk about Chile at all. So first of all, like before going deeper, why do you live in Chile?
Why do I live in Chile? I mean, I live in Chile for personal reasons because my partner lives and works in Chile. So,
Okay,
no, so I have no direct link with Chile or no previous link at least until basically, she got a job there. We decided to move there, right? So now my partner is from Latin America, so of course that's her home. But for me, from Belgium, that's a very different part of the world. But I very much enjoy living there, right? Very nice people. The south of Chile, extremely nice sort of environment. Politics, however, is a big problem in Chile,
really?
right? So,
I thought I thought they have a really good president right now, like someone who might
yeah,
have
but I
been.
mean, look, we basically have a left-wing president who can't really do anything, who also made a couple of mistakes, and unfortunately, the future isn't looking great. Like everything that's happening at the moment, it seems like the right wing is taking up a lot of power, and unfortunately, the right wing in Chile, they are really right wing. I mean, this is they have a lot of authoritarian tendencies. So it's this awkward mixture of extreme sort of neoliberal market privatization stuff combined with a lot of authoritarianism. So, we've seen, there was a lot of things happening in Chile, right? Just before COVID, we had a whole year of social protests, which then led to a constitutional convention. The constitutional convention was voted down a lot, partly because of a lot of misinformation campaigning, etc. That had a major negative impact on the government, right? So that backlash had a major impact on the government. One of the implications of all this, to be honest, is that I don't see much happening in terms of basic income debate as such. But I have to say, although I sort of live there, I really live in the south. I don't live in Santiago. I have no particular links with people there, right? But all I hear and see from various people is that, there are some people advocating for basic income, but the sort of promising links that there were with the government even a few years ago, all of that seemed to be going down, partly because at the moment the government itself can't really move, right? So, but it's not looking good for the future, as in expectations are that the next president will be, proper right wing and with everything that comes with that, and very little promising for basic income, unfortunately. So very different than Brazil. So Chile and Brazil, very different places to be thinking about basic income at the moment. So
It's like 2 years ago, Bolsonaro was the president of Brazil, so don't know.
true, but so here is an important thing. Brazil, something I learned when I visited there in the year, right? So I mean, I learn a lot from my Brazilian friends and colleagues. So every time I visit, they educate me properly. One of the things I learned, which is really fascinating, is that in Brazil, there's a lot of the distribution of power between the central state and the states. So the federal state and the states, and then even the municipalities, they have a lot of power. In Chile, that's not the case, right? So Chile, the central state has a lot more power than in Brazil. It's a lot more distributed. So that means in Brazil, you can have a Bolsonaro as president and still, within the different state or within the municipalities, they can do things because they have a lot more competences. They have a lot more power. Right, so it
So
matters. Political
so it's
system.
like, so I think decentralization
Exactly.
a positive thing for basic income.
Well, I mean, it's a positive thing for starting basic income at the municipal level. The question is, how does that? So one of the really interesting questions at the moment, for example, so you see all these initiatives happening at different levels, right? So you see basic income experiments, for example, or even policies, as in Brazil, happening at municipal level, right? These are communities that do their own thing. you see them happening at regional level. So Ontario in Canada, that was, a province. Catalonia in Spain, it's but the point is, it's a regional government, right? It's a regional government, Catalan government. This is not a Spanish government. This is the Catalan government. The same Scotland, right? Scotland was really interested in basic income, but it was Scotland. It was not the UK. Okay. So there's these regional things. And then of course, you have actual countries that do it, like as in full states like Finland or Ireland, right? So one of the really interesting questions, and actually this is a project that I'm sort of starting now with one of my colleagues, Mark Dussard from the US, who's an urban studies guy. So we're actually looking, or we want to look at, what are the political dynamics of thinking of basic income at these three different levels, right? So the political logic of starting a basic income at municipal level is going to be very, very different as the regional level and the state level, right? So I think, but this is something that we're just starting to look at, right? It's just an observation because we now have all these cases and it just starts opening up new questions, right? But what does that mean if we have a basic income at municipal level? Will that grow into a state level or regional level? Will that grow into a full national level? Who knows, right? We have no idea at the moment. So.
I guess it depends on the results. Like if the results on the municipal level are positive.
But it doesn't just depend on the results. There's plenty of cases where policies have very nice results and still it doesn't work in terms of pushing through political barriers, right? Politics is not just about results. It's not just about convincing people and saying, hey, look, this works. This is not per se how it happens, right? Government is about pressure, right? Politics is about pressure. You need to be able to really push it through.
So maybe like municipalities, like you just said about Maracana, yeah. It says that when it was successful, a lot of other municipalities tried to imitate it or like to do it in their way. So like maybe if you have like something of like competing municipalities that try to competing for people or so on, or like everyone wants to be like the best, or like just following the trend. Maybe like you need a number of municipalities of regions that are like kind of competing against and with each other.
I mean, you may be right? So this is something we're starting to look into now, right? What explains this spread of things? So partly it may be something like competition and reputation and, who knows? I mean, the interesting thing of the Brazil case, of course, is that the timing matters, as in it also interacts with the whole COVID period, right? So, so maybe it's a combination of COVID effectively causing, well, the problems we're all familiar with, right? Had major socioeconomic impact and lasting socioeconomic impact, right? It amongst other things, it also showed how very badly a lot of existing social protection mechanisms were able to handle a shock like that. So this is why governments everywhere around the world were trying to do new things or expanding, et cetera, making a lot of changes, even temporarily. But of course, the Marica thing then came in there. And in Marica, they were very, very fast at expanding the Renda Básica Cidadania, right? So their basic income type of policy, it was really fast. Within a couple of days, as soon as the economy blocked down, they increased the level. It was very, very fast. Whereas a lot of the other municipalities, they had a lot of trouble finding policies to support their people because it takes a lot of time to come up with a new policy, implement it, at the time when bureaucracy is very constrained, right? So it's all these pressures coming together. So yes, maybe all these other municipalities now, they're basically having that in mind and say, look, we want to have something similar. Who knows, right? And maybe it's really competition and reputation, and maybe it's pressure of particular groups. At the moment, we don't know. We're going to be looking into this, hopefully in a couple of months or next year. So
actually, like you brought me to another question. We have to start to keep it short because we're now at 1 hour, I think. But I wanted to ask you: do you think that we need like certain conditions, or is it like optimal conditions in a society and in the political frame of a society to implement basic income, or to be ready to accept basic income from politicians?
I mean, I don't even know what optimal conditions mean, right? So, and in a way, if we have to wait for optimal conditions, then who knows, right? When that's going to happen. I think in a sense it has to work the other way around. We need to accept the conditions that we have, and we need to adjust our strategies and possibly also our sort of designs of basic income to fit whatever works. So, for example, one implication is it may be that a basic income in Germany is just a very, very different type of design, or perhaps the implementation is different, or the trajectory is different. How do we get from here to there compared to other countries? So I think it really is about adjusting sort of both ways. Maybe for some things we need to wait for a window of opportunity, but we need to actually adjust what we want out of a basic income, what we can do. We need to be, we need, in a weird way, we need to both try and be radical and utopian, but pragmatic at the same time, right? And see how that works. But it literally means that I think, in a sense, although it's great to think of basic income as a global network, and we can learn a lot from each other, right? In so many ways. I think when it comes to the actual political fight and the implementation, you have to work within a country, because each country's political system and welfare state, etc., they're all different, right? And so, you need to effectively adjust things very carefully within each country and then try and push, right?
So without, I don't know if you're an expert or not, but like without being an expert on any of those countries, if a politician from those countries came to you and told you like, hey, I want to implement a basic income, I've spoken like with the party leadership, they're also like pro it. What do you think are the most important steps to take? Like, let's assume the two countries are, for example, Norway and North Korea. What would you advise in Norway? What would you advise in North Korea?
I have no advice for North Korea. I was in South Korea, a few months ago, and like that's a very peculiar situation. I'm there. I'm not gonna go into this. As for another country, I actually don't know very much about Norway either. So my very obvious response to things like that, and I've sort of been in situations like this, is to try and link them in as much as possible with local people, right? I'm a very firm believer that, in a sense, the last thing we need, so to speak, is for politicians to start finding expertise all over the world when actually a lot of what you need is locally available, right? So, there's no point the reason I got involved in the Finnish experiment was because I was doing my PhD in Finland and I was working with people in Finland, right? I didn't come from the outside, so to speak, right? And of course, it's always good to get some outside consultants, etc. But it's the local people who are doing all the work. If you look, for example, what's happening in Marika, this is people, this is the municipality of Marika with the community bank in Marika, with researchers who are, from Niteroi, which is just next to Marika. These are local people who really know what's going on there, and they're working on this, right? So I think that's important, right? So I think, in a sense, yes, I move around a lot. I'm very fascinated by different cases, but I'm not going to go to a politician and saying that, I have a really good idea. Here is how you should be doing it. I prefer to link them to some of the local people, and hopefully that works.
So we don't want to do like the IMF or so.
No, we don't want to be the IMF. No, I think I think that's a pretty good conclusion. Yes, let's not be the IMF.
I wanted to ask you, like, yeah, shortly, like, about. I read that you're also like into music and underground music,
Yeah, kind of.
and that you even connect that with basic income somehow.
Um, Not in any direct way, but you'll be very interesting to hear. There's a metal band called Prong that has a song called Unconditional. And I've always been tempted, if maybe I should do this one time. I didn't do it in Korea, but if ever I get to be on a plenary session of Bien, maybe Bene Enter, I will play that song.
Oh yeah,
They
let's.
probably it will empty the room, unfortunately, which is the slight downside. But otherwise, it's kind of nice to hear that, there's actual metal band with a song called Unconditional. So
We'll try to add the link for the song on the description. So one last question from my side, and after that, yeah, we can see if you have any question or anything. But what would you say is like the most important things that you learned, and what our audience can learn from you and your travels, your experience from different people with different areas, different regions? You can have a long answer.
no. I mean, in a way, I've kind of mentioned this before. I think one of the things I learned when I move around a lot is how different places can be. Right. So how actually the same idea that we talk about when we all meet in a congress or something, the moment it moves back home, so to speak, wherever that is, it takes its own shape. Why? Because it's carried by local people in a very specific context, etc., etc. So one of the things I really learned by moving around this lot is really appreciating the importance of the local context of how details matter with something like basic income. So, and it kind of goes back to what I mentioned before, if politicians are looking for advice, where possible, direct them to local people. They know how things work there. They have the expertise, etc., right? So it's also a reason, for example, people often ask me, why do we need to do more experiments? It's not because we need to know about behavior per se or labor market or this. One of the things we learn about these experiments is how to fit the basic income into the local context. And the local context is always different, right? Local contexts are different programs and different cultures and different institutions and different history, you name it, right? And then we bring something like basic income in there. And it's a radical thing, right? It's literally like bringing a new animal into an ecosystem, and it's going to have to adjust, and we have to see how it works, etc., etc. So we need to do this every time and again. We need to learn this in each country, so to speak, right? So
that's interesting. So do you have like any final remarks, any message to our audience?
Fun mission. I'll end with one thing, which is with one of my mantras, which kind of ties in what I said before. I think one of the biggest myths that we have with basic income is that basic income is a very simple idea. Yes, it looks very simple. Basic income, people, Van Parijs very famously says that basic income is a disarmingly simple idea. And lots of people always argue this. Basic income is so simple, we should just do it. The moment you put basic income as a policy implemented in a country, it meets complexity. So you put a simple thing into a complex environment, it's no longer simple, it becomes complex. And we should appreciate that. And that's one of the biggest lessons that I learned in doing this for quite a while. So
thank you very much, Jürgen. It was really great having you here. And I'm sure that will not be the last time our audience will see you. But let's close it for today.
Great. Well, thanks for having me, Ahmed. It's been a pleasure. Okay. And good luck with the rest of the podcast.